Hello! I just finished up a multi-month long project on Arcane, and boy are my arms tired. Now that I've gotten that out of my system, it's time to go back to authoritatively inventing hyper-specific writing rules to enforce regular channel uploads while I work on a far too in-depth 10-year anniversary special. There's no easy way to say this, but I've started watching Lost again. I couldn't help it, someone brought it to a party, and I was just gonna have one episode, but what am I supposed to do after that pilot? Just stop? I brought it to the party. I will have a whole video on it one of these days, but that's not what this is. It just reminded me of a scale I've been putting together to explain why some TV shows and movies feel wrong, while others feel perfect. Before I started making these videos, I assumed that most people thought about all the same things I did when they watched stuff. After a couple of them, I quickly started to suspect that might not be the case. Since the Arcane video, it's become incredibly apparent that I am insane, but also correct, or at least over-prepared. Either way, I will win. I've gathered that most people watch their media pretty passively and simply like it or don't, and they don't think that much about why. Sounds peaceful and impossible. I can't do that. I must quantify my feelings. You know that vague, indescribable lack of focus you get when you just kinda aren't vibing with whatever you're trying to watch? Well, I've made a graph about it. What we're talking about in a word is tone, not as an individual momentary vibe like wholesome or spooky or funny, but as an overall style, a broad set of expectations like a flavor profile or a color palette. Tone is what defines a piece of media's relationship with its audience. It's how you pick what to watch. You might have a whole list of incredible drama films that's been slowly growing over the last 8 years because you just never have enough time to watch it all, even though you always say you really want to. They're all supposed to be amazing, but now it's 10 p.m. on a Thursday, and you're gonna put The Office on again, because that's what you need right now. I've described this relationship with food metaphors for a long time, like how an award-winning indie film can be satisfying in the same way as a niche health food restaurant, and a Marvel movie can be like going to get a new flavor of ice cream, but one isn't necessarily better, because like if you're in the mood for ice cream, a kale salad ain't gonna cut it. But as I dive perpetually deeper into the mechanics of writing, I've realized I need something more consistent and less subjective, and from that, I have developed a scale of realism to absurdity. Imagine this simple scenario. You walk outside to get your mail. You exit your front door and you go to the elevator, passing your loud neighbors in the halls. He's always playing music late at night. You get in the elevator and ride it down to the first floor. You arrive in the mailroom as the mail is getting delivered and watch the postman place mail through the slot in your box. You open it with a key, take the mail, and leave. You go to take the elevator back up, but see it's at the top floor, and not wanting to wait, you decide to take the stairs. Simple, pretty boring. This is peak realism. It's just life without a single hot traumatized vampire for us to warm up to. 1 star. Let's try again. You exit your front window and float to the nearby elevator pod, passing your loud neighbors in the clouds who are attempting to fuse together a massive pile of meat to give it life and sentience. You press a button, instantly teleporting yourself to the 70s, where you walk into a cosmic mail puddle. The mail mouth asks, "Why the long face?" confirming your suspicions that you are a zebra today, and then spits out a package you've been waiting for. You say thank you and go to take the elevator again, but decide against another existential crisis of your continuity of existence and take the stairs. Elevators always suck. The absurd is anything that is not standard to our reality. Things that push against our expectations. This includes anything from improbable coincidences to being able to ignore the laws of physics. But it also includes singing your feelings in a choreographed musical number or turning on the TV at just the right time to see a news story relevant to your situation. Realism is the baseline, and all fiction mixes absurdity into it, like adding milk and sugar to black coffee. Without the absurd, you have a Civil War documentary narrated by a folksy old man, or just like raw footage. The presentation is what breaks the realism and starts making it a story. Even at the birth of filmmaking, when someone just pointed a camera at a train, which would be incredibly boring by today's standards, it was absurd that a picture was moving. It doesn't seem like this is a concept you could fail at, but people will surprise you, and it leads us back to a familiar question we have yet to fully answer. Why is Fallout bad? What, you thought I was done with that? Not even close! Amazon's Fallout show is what started me on this whole idea. Obviously, I've talked about my issues with its characters and structure, but I actually think a story can survive both of those flaws if it can nail its tone. And Fallout also didn't do that. Contributing to the overall problem of having nothing to grab onto, I could never tell if this show wanted to be funny, or campy, or dramatic, or sad, and so I never had any firm expectations for what came next. I never knew what I had signed up for. That can sound like a compliment, like your work is subversive and original, but if you've watched my previous videos, hopefully I've explained clearly enough how failing to establish expectations makes it difficult for your audience to become invested enough for you to then subvert those expectations and actually make a point. In trying to understand what they did wrong, I started off with a linear spectrum from reality to absurdity, with the premise being that great writing landed somewhere in the middle. perfectly balanced, as all things should be. I thought Fallout leaned too absurd without enough familiarity to balance it out, but when I tried to apply this to other media, it didn't always fit, and it didn't explain the difference between things that did work in different ways. Something like The Office could be considered balanced, with just enough absurdity to compensate for the pretty mundane realism, but so could BoJack Horseman, which has to make up for being incredibly depressing by also existing in a world full of animal hybrids who say puns a lot. Realizing I needed a second axis of measurement, I landed on this graph. On one axis we have the concept, and on the other, the execution. In the very bottom left corner, we have a realistic situation depicted completely realistically, which is a history lesson. On the opposite end, we have absurdly executed absurdity. Pure nonsense, like a Flash cartoon on a drug trip. In narrative writing, we generally want to avoid these extremes simply because they are not stories. But I think you can pick any other point on this graph and write a good story using that tone. That said, some are going to be easier to pull off than others. Realistic absurdity or absurd realism are the most forgiving quadrants to work with, I think, because you tend to be working with two contrasting extremes, and adding or subtracting a little bit from one side or the other isn't going to change much. These two corners represent those points of balance I mentioned earlier, and unsurprisingly, seem to be what most stories are aiming for, or at least the ones that do tend to become more popular. Let's start here. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a perfect example of a grounded concept told through an absurdist lens. At its core, it's just about two lame and selfish 20-somethings who find each other and have to deal with each other's baggage. It takes this grounded premise and combines it with a hyper-stylized world in which video game mechanics, anime battles, and massive spectacle are just a part of daily life. It's a world where being vegan gives you superpowers, where being defeated means you explode into coins, and sometimes to date someone you have to fight their ex who has become a 1,000-foot-tall monster on top of the school. This allows each action scene to serve two purposes, being an entertaining and well-choreographed fight for the viewers, while simultaneously developing Scott and Ramona's characters and furthering the plot. A lot of different tone-setting methods are on display across all of these adaptations, all working together to create the feeling of Scott Pilgrim. In every iteration of the story, there are consistent choices in dialogue and themes and character simplicity, and there are inherently absurd events like Scott having to fight his shadow self or getting interrupted by the vegan police. Depending on the medium, though, the artists use the tools they have available to support that tone. In the live-action movie, they use tools specific to filmmaking like on-screen graphics, sound effects, and clever editing. They actually have to ramp up the absurdity and energy compared to the comics to maintain this ratio, because now they're using real people, which grounds it more. Even the choice of medium plays into this balance. BoJack, Community, Arrested Development, The White Lotus, basically any real-world concept told with some amount of artistic flair or added fantasy elements fits into this square. Severance? Maybe? It's on the horizontal line. The absurdity comes through almost entirely in the execution here. Musicals often belong here because they're simple stories told through high-energy song and dance numbers to make their point more obvious and visceral. Over in the opposite quadrant is where we would see an absurd premise examined very practically. It's the same idea of using contrast to clarify your themes, but in this version we make our characters or subject feel too big for the world, as opposed to the previous category where the world itself is overwhelming. Sci-fi goes well here because it's usually about some crazy new technology interacting with and being digested by our familiar reality, or at least a foundational representation of it. Things like Arcane, Harry Potter, Stranger Things, Lost, most of the better superhero movies. A great modern example is What We Do in the Shadows, which starts off on the inherently fantastical premise of undead vampires with magical powers and world domination plans, but instead of presenting it to us as some kind of dark magic epic, we get a mockumentary about these dysfunctional immortal idiots living on Staten Island and dealing with their HOA. And it grounds all that absurdity in a life that we're all pretty familiar with to show us how ridiculous it really is. I'm especially partial to this category. I love stories about supernatural beings just having to deal with mundane shit. My favorite parts of Doctor Who are when they're just trapped on Earth and forced to have dinner with the companion's family, or when they cross paths with some normal person just trying to live their life and have to quickly explain things like, yeah, it's bigger on the inside, I'm an alien, I have two hearts, don't worry about it. The Russell T Davies seasons were especially good at this. Even when the normal world they were encountering had, like, cat people, it was kind of incredible. I think even the Avengers work best when they all just take a break and try to lift Thor's hammer or whatever, because that's what we'd do. That behavior is the realism that makes the fiction feel tangible. That doesn't mean these stories have to be constantly mundane or dreary to function. That may be your preference, but remember that we have this whole graph to move around in. Plenty of wild action occurs in Marvel movies and in Doctor Who, leaning them more toward absurd execution, but they choose to pull back and ground themselves in reality by including these kinds of scenes specifically whenever they become relevant. I'll get into more, I gotta drink water. I'll get into more detail later about what it looks like when this isn't done well, but I want to note here that adding reality is not the same as just making something dark or meta. Heroes, for example, is supposed to be a show about people with superpowers addressed very realistically, but having recently attempted to revisit it after watching it back in college, I can confirm that it really just takes itself way too seriously. The show is very depressing and nihilistic, but I wouldn't describe it as real, because I don't live in a world where everything feels this severe all the time. The most realistic parts of the show are Hiro and Ando because they're the only ones who react to their newfound powers with any levity or curiosity. Similarly, Marvel caught on to the fact that people liked it when the superheroes acted casual and aloof about their dire circumstances, and after the success of Guardians of the Galaxy and Deadpool, they definitely ramped up the irreverent jabs at their own storytelling, but that also doesn't inherently feel more realistic in every situation, you know? It's normal to take serious things seriously, and to be amused when things get silly. Realistic execution involves adding appropriate human responses to the bizarre things you've introduced into the world, from people's off-the-cuff emotional reactions to details of how they deal with this new thing once it becomes ingrained in their lives. This is a super specific reference, but in the PS4 Spider-Man game, specifically the Silver Linings DLC, there's a bit of dialogue that can play where Peter is making Miles do physics equations to practice calculating the arc of a pendulum because he has to do that in his head every time he swings. And it's that kind of thing that, to me, makes these stories feel like they're being experienced by a real person who we are then watching. If you're trying to decide what vibe to give your own story, it's hard to go wrong with one of these two directions. There's a lot of fertile ground in both quadrants, and even done poorly, these rarely turn out worse than fine. As we move into the other two quadrants, however, we get closer to what I've decided to call the danger diagonal, and our job as a writer becomes exponentially more difficult. It's not that stories in these two sections can't work. Very much to the contrary, some of the most impressive and timeless media exists along this line. I think it's more that any mistakes or lack of dedication in a work of straight realism become far more obvious, and a total absence of anything to ground us in a work of total absurdity makes it significantly easier to lose your audience. Remember, actual pure realism is just a history textbook, and nobody wants to watch that. Every good story has some absurdity sprinkled on top to make the pill go down. Just making something dark and gritty is not a recipe for realism or quality, despite what you may have heard from that one friend who's really into Tarantino movies and hates everything else you ever try to show him. Also a reminder that Quentin Tarantino once said in an interview that having sex with a 13-year-old girl isn't rape as long as she wanted it. Whoops, how'd that get in there? I generally try to avoid talking about Breaking Bad, because what else is there to say about it? It's very good. It's as good as everyone says it is. Super boring. Anyway, it came out during the golden age of making things dark and real, and has a well-earned reputation of being very grounded in its premise. So it's a great example of how to achieve a tone within this quadrant. What makes the tone of Breaking Bad stand out from its peers is largely levity. During an era when Game of Thrones and True Detective were being praised for never giving their audience a moment to breathe, this show was mixing equally captivating drama with Jesse Pinkman. Yes, science! For a show about a horrible man making meth to pay for his cancer treatment, it really knows when and how to lighten the mood. The way it does this isn't flashy. The show understands its characters well. Jesse is kinda dumb and irreverent and optimistic and excitable. Walt is pretentious and stubborn and judgmental. When you trap these two together and force them to use their limited resources to accomplish a difficult and illegal task, funny things are gonna happen. Because despite mostly existing within the realm of possibility, the show still includes absurd elements. A chemistry teacher becomes an international drug lord. He blows up people with bags of chemicals. He melts a guy. He gets involved with a meth empire operating out of a fried chicken restaurant, and he successfully hides all of it from his family, including a DEA agent. In the realm of fiction, that's all relatively mild, like nobody's secretly a ghost the whole time or anything. But even though it's all technically possible, it would still be crazy if it happened in real life. The key to successfully writing this kind of tone is to overpay for your absurdity. Cool, dramatic moments are allowed, but they need to either be earned ahead of time or paid for afterwards with interest. Or both. Like the episode where Walter shaves his head, introduces himself as Heisenberg, and extorts an established drug lord for $50,000 with a bag of explosives, only happens after he's been diagnosed with terminal cancer, gassed himself in his first attempt to make meth, lied to his family, almost gotten killed, almost gotten caught, had to trap a guy in a basement and eventually murder him and dispose of his body in the grossest way possible, and gotten his partner beaten up so badly he's in the ER. And then he also deals with the consequences of that decision for the rest of the show. So yeah, he got to be cool for a second, but at what cost? Familiarity is the key to a realistic premise, and consequences are the key to a realistic presentation, and they both carry a lot of weight. weight, sometimes enough to drag down total fiction. I might even put The Last of Us in this quadrant just because the occasional mushroom zombie feels very trivial compared to the crushing reality of watching people endure and survive in the very believable remains of the world we all know. You can go too heavy on the consequences, though. Game of Thrones taught us all that we can only take so much punishment before we expect some payoff, and if you don't deliver, you might ruin 7 seasons of television. It's all a big balancing act. If you don't want to deal with any of that, you can travel up the danger diagonal, leaving all that realism behind and enter a world of pure imagination. This is where you make art. It's also where nobody watches your movie. That's not totally fair. There are plenty of popular stories that land within this quadrant. SpongeBob, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Door Monster sketches. Most animation lives here because it offers the freedom to stretch boundaries and play with the impossible. Your medium of choice again plays into your tone, and animation encourages you to push your imagination to its limit. Achieving the same level of wild expression with live action is an uphill battle, unless you're India. This is the most interesting tonal quadrant for me and might just be my favorite because it's incredibly unpredictable and the failure rate is enormous. When done well, these can be some of the most profound and personal works of art ever seen, and the other 90% of the time, it's hilariously bad. Very occasionally, Hollywood achieves something in this square that gains critical acclaim, like Everything Everywhere All at Once. But more often than not, the result of this experiment is a strange tone we call camp, and the creation of a cult classic. Fusing absurdity with absurdity is a volatile process, and naturally produces comedy as a byproduct because weird things are funny, even if that's not your intention. So balancing on this line without becoming comedic is nearly impossible, and I find it's just better to lean into it. That said, you can really spice these things up by adding a dash of realism to remind everyone they're still depressed, like that Ice King episode. It's the inverse of Breaking Bad occasionally tossing a whole pizza onto the roof to remind you that Walter White is a silly little man-child. I tried looking up examples of cult classics, by the way, and people were listing things like Pulp Fiction and Grease. And I think if you're calling Grease a cult classic, expand your movie selection. Plus, it's definitely down, like, here in the bottom. Absurd as hell execution, but the story is just like a high school romance. Real cult classics are movies most people don't like because they're at least kind of bad, but the flavor is so specific that it might be exactly your thing. We're talking Rocky Horror Picture Show, The Heathers, Clue, Video Game High School, this movie Allison likes called Repo the Genetic Opera that I have somehow seen way more times than I ever wanted to, but have now also started to like.
Zytrate comes in a little glass vial.
A little glass vial?
Even popular stories in this category are more niche than others. Your grandma has seen Star Wars, but probably not Adventure Time. With some exceptions, if you choose to go the absurdity route, you're limiting yourself to straight up comedy or some niche interest. And that's not bad, it's just a commitment. So, if any of these tones are fine, how exactly do you mess it up? What is that feeling you get when a Marvel superhero undercuts every dramatic moment with a snarky quip? Why do we check out when Arcane Season 2 tries to get deep and emotional even though we were totally invested in Season 1? Why does that little goblin musical feel so out of place in the 15th Doctor's first episode? If all you have to do is pick a point on this graph, how can you possibly do that wrong? It's annoyingly simple. You just don't do it. As a writer, you can't know how to introduce a character, address an emotional moment, or give the audience information about your world if you don't know what kind of story you're writing. If you and your team of Disney executives don't understand and agree on the tone of your story ahead of time, it's inevitably going to change from scene to scene, and it's not going to be clear how those conflicting tones should interact when they end up in the same scene together. There are ways for tone to shift and for the point on this graph to move, but it has to happen one of two ways, either gradually, over a long period of time, like in Barry or Steven Universe, or suddenly and probably briefly for the sake of punching up a particular emotion. Like when Willy Wonka takes all those children through a nightmare tunnel and then acts like nothing happened, or in Toy Story 3 when all our favorite childhood characters accept and await their inevitable death. For any of those changes to be impactful, the original tone has to be clearly established in the first place. And if the tone is constantly changing from the get-go without any sense of a baseline, then you have not picked a tone. Back when I first brought up the Fallout show, I talked about how it doesn't establish a normal to measure itself against. So it's difficult to care about what's happening until you've already invested several hours for the sake of proving your point in a second and third YouTube video because nobody liked it when you correctly pointed out all these problems based purely on the pilot. I've talked about its issues with character consistency and prioritizing mystery over drama, but the fabric that really fails to hold all those elements together is the inconsistent tone. The whole reason this graph developed is because I didn't know where to put Fallout on it. For a while, I just thought it wasn't balancing its absurdity with enough realism, or vice versa, but it has a healthy dose of both. It's a fairly grounded apocalypse event, in that nukes are real and the threat of planet-destroying bombs dropping on quiet, idealistic American neighborhoods was something people actually lived in fear of for decades. But it's also set in an alternate universe with robots and mutants and giant cockroaches and cartoon radiation mechanics. The world is clearly established, especially through the games, even if that information is given boringly and at weird times in the show. That puts us probably somewhere north of realism on the concept axis of our graph. It's the execution where things start to fall apart. Broadly, we have two options here. Make this a show where we explore an alternate timeline apocalypse scenario by watching relatable characters deal with the consequences of all of these alien circumstances while incorporating familiar elements of our own world, or we go nuts. In other words, are we dealing with The Last of Us or Mad Max Fury Road? Remember, you can pick one and occasionally dip into others to make a point, but there's gotta be a baseline for the contrast to be effective. In Fallout, we've got comic book battle scenes, somber flashbacks of the world we left behind, cartoonishly violent comedy, realistically violent torture, two wacky friends from two different cults who go on a road trip of misadventures, existential body horror, the cast of Futurama, overt criticism of capitalism and American politics, and a brain Roomba. Depending on the scene, it alternates between an attempt at campy, surreal comedy, visceral survival horror, and deep introspective commentary without ever picking a lane or managing to blend those into something unique. Any one of those things could be in a Fallout show. Hell, take half of them. But bouncing around between all of that stuff makes it really hard to establish expectations. Even if it works in the games, that's a different medium. TV shows are linear, while games usually allow for at least some amount of freedom to set your own pace and explore the story your own way. Red Dead Redemption 2 has deep emotional moments about violence and accountability, and also you can tie a guy to your horse and then launch that horse off a cliff, but it would be weird to put both of those in the same movie. You can make an argument for why any particular tone in the show makes sense, but the same tone rarely flows smoothly from one scene to another. The lack of consistency is especially noticeable every time they try to do that tonally dissonant music thing. Something horribly violent happens while upbeat music plays in the background, and it's supposed to take you out of the scene just enough for you to go, wow, I guess war really does never change when you think about it. This technique is supposed to drive home a heart-wrenching emotional theme by accentuating a sharp contradiction of expectations. But we don't have any of those. Like in this scene from the last episode, what am I supposed to be feeling? That we've all come so far only to fall victim to the base violence we all carry in our hearts? Because this has been happening the whole time. Is the music supposed to make me nostalgic for the beginning of the show when things were simple and our characters were happy? Because that part sucked. They try to do this multiple times, including in the first episode, which is the only time it actually makes any sense, and that makes it even more confusing that they couldn't just keep doing it right later. It's just such a cheap, easy trick. It's been done 1,000 times. It's an American Psycho, Back to the Future, Cabin in the Woods, all of BioShock. It's why kids sing nursery rhymes in horror movie trailers. It's like the entire premise of Five Nights at Freddy's. The song What a Wonderful World has only ever been used ironically. It's so common that the TV tropes page for soundtrack dissonance includes a pinball category because it appears in more than one pinball game. Heroes did it, Lost did it, Deadpool did it, of course. I swear a decade ago, every franchise leaned on this same genre of music so much that we now associate 50s jazz with an immediate sense of dread. And it would be so perfect here if they just knew what their story was about. The sounds of blindingly optimistic American exceptionalism floating gently over the war-torn wasteland it leads to, that's a whole tone and story all by itself without even having to make a show. It's so obvious and overdone that somebody must have used it perfectly once, and then everybody else just copied them.
Then what will you do?
Oh right, it was Fallout! Anyway, that's how you keep a consistent tone for your movie. Leave a comment with a topic you'd like to see next time. There's a whole bunch of suggestions right here. Also, you can sign up on patreon.com/doormonster for updates, quarterly merch, and a producer credit on the 10-year anniversary videos. And be sure to stick around for a fan-sponsored ad. If you'd like to advertise something on one of these videos, literally anything you're working on, hit me up and we can work out a price because I'd rather show off your cool stuff than a VPN. I think if you took this graph and you like folded it so all four corners were touching each other, that would be Airplane, a comedy from 1980. So it's not perfect. Ta-da. I said you can advertise anything, and I meant it. Some of you may know Mafek. He's a prominent community member and longtime supporter of Door Monster. He asked if I could use an ad slot to help out his niece and sister-in-law. His niece is autistic and needs special care, and also has been abused by a family member that they used to live with. While living with other family members, this information came out, and they lost their place to stay. Vivek is now trying to help them set up in a new apartment and get back on their feet. His sister-in-law is trying to get a CDL to get a higher paying job and just to make sure that they can like pay rent and bills and things. But he's setting up a GoFundMe just to help cover basic costs of living in the meantime while they get everything together. And that link will be here on the bottom of the screen and in the description. Really just any amount will be helpful. Anything you can toss their way is awesome. And thank you in advance from me and on behalf of Vivek and his family. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting on Patreon if you have been. I'm establishing a new workflow where I have Cassandra and Backdoor helping me on these videos. They didn't as much on this one because I was very irresponsible and I took too long to get it filmed. They are waiting for me to send them scripts and footage so that they can help me produce these faster. And there's going to be another one later this month. The anniversary specials are coming along great. I just was taking longer than I thought it would, which will be on my gravestone. But it is going to be awesome, and all of your donations have been really helpful. And if you still want to be a producer on it and get a credit on the videos, head on over to Patreon. There's a $50 tier there that you can donate on for even a month. It will add your name to the list. You can also, this is a lot of plugging for me compared to usual, but you can also go to one of the 2 YouTube channels that I'm putting up here on the screen and also in the description to see live streams. Allison and I stream once a week on the Chaos Cottage channel, which used to be her old personal channel. And I've been doing like co-work lo-fi streams over on the Door Monster Studio channel. Go check out the Discord, that's where we post the announcements. Sometimes Matt streams from his bus. We also have new merch, actually. I guess I have a lot of new stuff. Links in the description. Thanks for watching. Be back in 2 weeks. Goodbye.